All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Arizona Department of Water Resources. Today's meeting is the third public meeting as a part of the ADA's informal rulemaking process. Our agenda for today is on the screen, and we will begin with introductions. My name is Lainey Meeker, and I'm the statewide program supervisor for the department, and I'm joined today by Natalie Mast, the AMA's director, and Nicole Klobus, our chief counsel for the department. Today's meeting is not a formal public hearing, excuse me. This meeting is being broadcast via webinar and is being recorded. The recording will be made available online at the website link up on the screen. Please keep your phone or audio connection on mute. And again, I want to iterate that today's meeting is not a formal public hearing. We'll begin with some background and review of the ADAS process so far. On April 9, 2024, ADWR published and made available the ADAS draft rules. ADWR presented on the draft rules on April 22, 2024, and will not be presenting on the draft rules again today. The draft rules and meeting recordings are available on ADWR's website. We received robust comments from stakeholders on the draft rules by the May 3, 2024 deadline, and ADWR's responses will be discussed today. We met with AZ Water Co. on 3 occasions, including a recent July 24, 2024 meeting regarding provisions of the ADAS draft rules that apply in the Pinal AMA. So for some additional background and to refresh everyone's memories, I'd like to briefly walk through our example on how ADAS works. You have seen these slides before. I will note that these examples were developed when we were using 2021 as the year that we were working from, but they apply regardless. We begin with an undesignated provider's starting scenario in terms of its groundwater use and pumping. In this example, the water provider has 2,000 acre-feet of unbuilt certificate demand, 80,000 acre-feet per year of groundwater being delivered to certificated subdivisions, 8,000, sorry, I have an extra zero there, and 10,000 acre-feet of groundwater being delivered to non-assured water supply or pre-1995 uses. The total 2021 groundwater volume is 20,000 acre-feet per year. The provider applies for the ADAS and adds new water supplies, in this case, 8,000 acre-feet per year of new alternative water supplies. When the new alternative supplies are included in the designation, 5,600 acre-feet per year, or 70% of the new alternative supplies, will go to serve new demands. 2,400 acre-feet a year would substitute for the 2021 groundwater demands. After the new alternative supplies are included, the total groundwater volume per year is reduced from 20,000 acre-feet to 17,600 acre-feet per year, and this volume would now be their grandfathered groundwater volume. This example above explains the benefit to the aquifer. The hypothetical provider has a total 2021 groundwater volume of 20,000 acre-feet a year, which includes both unreplenished and replenished groundwater withdrawals. Without designation, the unreplenished, non-assured water supply groundwater uses could continue, and it could continue to grow relatively unconstrained beyond the 2021 volume. However, after the designation under this pathway, the total groundwater pumping would be reduced to 17,600 acre-feet a year, or 1.76 million acre-feet over the 100-year period. Because it is under designation, groundwater pumping could not increase. There is an initial benefit to the aquifer of 240,000 acre-feet over 100 years through reduced pumping. But the total benefit to the aquifer will likely be greater because part of the 17,600 acre-feet a year groundwater volume that was previously unreplenished will now be replenished. Although a groundwater allowance would be provided, it would not cover the total 2021 unreplenished volume. And if new alternative supplies are added on an expedited basis, this will further reduce the 17,600 acre-feet a year groundwater volume. So this is an example of how the expedited modification works as a new supply becomes available to the provider. In the initial period, starting at year 0, the provider becomes designated under this alternative pathway. This resolves the commingling issue, and the provider is now able to add new alternative supplies to their portfolio. New growth is approved on 70% of the new alternative supply, with 30% of that new supply offsetting existing groundwater use. In the years that follow, the provider is able to acquire an additional alternative supply, but it will take a few years to build the infrastructure to put it to use. The provider has the necessary agreements, planning, and financing in place, then the project would be completed in 5 years. The provider applies for and receives an expedited modification of the designation. If the provider is now approved under the modified designation to grow on 70% of that newly acquired supply, and again, then 30% of the additional supply offsets the existing groundwater use. The provider may use any combination of supplies during this interim period. Once the infrastructure is completed and the new supplies are in use, the designation continues until the end of the term unless the designation is modified. It is envisioned that modification could occur multiple times as new supplies become available, allowing for incremental growth and incremental transition away from groundwater pumping. I'll now hand off to Natalie Mast, AEWR's Active Management Area Director, to walk through the groundwater allowance analysis.
Thanks, Lainey. All right, so I think this piece is probably new for most of you. The ADOS proposal would include a groundwater allowance, would allow designations to include groundwater that is grandfathered in for the purposes of physical availability, as Lainey talked about, and for the purposes of consistency with the management goal, which is what I'm going to be focusing on. There we go. So the groundwater allowance is included as a part of the ADOS proposal, really as a transitional consideration to allow a transition to additional replenishment and or new supplies. Again, it's important to distinguish here between the grandfathered volume, which is related to physical availability, and the groundwater allowance that I'll be talking about, which contributes to demonstrating consistency with the management goal. So these are different criteria for the purposes of an assured water supply determination, and these are different volumes that would have to be considered as a part of any determination of assured water supply. So this volume that we're talking about, the groundwater allowance, is an amount that is not required to be replenished. So it's intended to help, it's an amount of groundwater that can be used that would not be required to be replenished, intended to help with a transition to alternative supplies. Some things that we really considered as a part of developing a groundwater allowance proposal for the ADOS is that it had to represent a net benefit to the aquifer. We know that there are groundwater challenges in these areas. And so, to put it really bluntly, we can't dig that hole deeper. We have to contribute to improving some of those physical availability issues that we're seeing in these AMAs. So, on the other side of that, the benefit to the aquifer has to be balanced with a need for reasonable and achievable replenishment obligations. We actually have to be able to replenish the water that we're saying will need to be replenished. So the way we structured the groundwater allowance, and I'll show some kind of specific examples in a little bit here. The demands and groundwater allowances associated with existing certificates and existing CAGRD member lands are pulled out of the calculation. And those groundwater allowances are carried forward and kind of maintained. They would be applied to a future ADOS determination. For any remaining lands, those lands that were not covered by a certificate, the remainder of the service area is allowed to choose between two options for the calculation of their groundwater allowance. One option is their unreplenished groundwater volume from 2023 times a 20-year factor, so times 20. The other option is their, oh, you know what, there's a typo on there, sorry about that. That first line is supposed to say their 2023 total volume of water use. I apologize for the error there. So it's their total volume of water use times 20, or their total groundwater volume times 30. And that's the 2023 volumes. The examples that I'm going to show on the next slides are going to reflect data from 2021 and 2022. The reason for that is that we don't have our full data set for 2023 yet because of timelines associated with QA/QC on annual reporting information and also getting information from the CAGRD to finalize that 2023 analysis. So we will be analyzing that later in the summer as we get those values. Oops. So the way we analyzed this groundwater allowance proposal is we carried forward the current portfolios and volumes of water for four potential providers that we see as providers that could potentially utilize ADAS. So we have Apache Junction, that's an Arizona Water Company system, Queen Creek, Epcor Agua Fria, and the city of Buckeye. We are assuming here that we would issue a lump sum groundwater allowance at the beginning of the 100-year period that provider could debit from and kind of manage as they see fit, rather than parsing it out over the 100-year period. We also included in this analysis a 4% incidental recharge rate. So to show some kind of general results here, what we were able to see is that by using this type of calculation for those target providers with 2021 data, we're seeing between 200,000 and a little over 400,000 acre feet in those initial groundwater allowances, that lump sum at the beginning. But despite those relatively large numbers, you are seeing that the amount of water that would be replenished is increasing, and the amount of groundwater mining that would occur over that time period is decreasing substantially. So what we're really able to show here is that we can have this kind of transitional volume and still lead to a net benefit for the aquifer over time. The 2022 data is really similar, and what we really wanted to understand was, do different years really make a difference? What we're seeing in the numbers that we've looked at in the different years of analysis that we've looked at is the year that we base this on probably doesn't really matter that much. What we see is with a structure like this, we can expect that the ADAS structure with a groundwater allowance would lead to increased replenishment and reduced groundwater mining over time. So.
All right, I will now go through the summary of comments and responses. Our first set of comments relate to the rule that allows for commingling under certain circumstances for certificate applications. We only received comments that expressed concerns regarding the constitutionality of the commingling provision. We did not receive any other comments in favor of or opposed to that particular rule provision. Because of those concerns and our desire to look a little bit more closely at those issues and consider the opportunity to have additional stakeholder feedback, we're going to move the commingling rule into a separate rulemaking package. We intend to move that forward and file it and hope that it stays in a parallel process, moving at the same pace as the remainder of the ADAS package. But if we do need more time to develop that rulemaking, then that will allow us the time to do so while allowing the remainder of the package to move forward. Uh, We also received several comments proposing that we change the pump year for the groundwater allowance calculation from 2021, which is the assumption we used during during the Governor's Water Policy Council discussions and our initial rulemaking draft, to either 2022, 2023, or the year prior to applying for the designation. As Natalie just showed you, we did not see a significant difference in the groundwater allowance for those two, for 2021 or 2022. We think that demonstrates that we're unlikely to see a substantial difference between those 2 years and 2023. We have decided that we will change the pump year to 2023. And again, we don't have those numbers verified yet, so we are going to clarify in the rule language that that's subject to ADWR's verification of those numbers. There is a lot of verification that the annual reports go through. And we'll use that year both for groundwater allowance and for the physical availability grandfathered groundwater volume. So we will be updating that year. Stakeholders also proposed that we reduce the groundwater offset to 5%. There were other stakeholders that proposed that we increase the groundwater offset. During the Governor's Water Policy Council process, we had discussed an offset of 30% for ADAS. In the first draft of the rules that we shared in April, we used 25% as the groundwater offset. And then for the certificates, we used 30% because we want to incentivize ADAS relative to certificates. We think that that's the appropriate number. The important thing to remember is that this groundwater offset is really critical to making ADAS work. It is effectively an exemption from the physical availability requirement for that volume of groundwater. The applicant is not having to demonstrate that groundwater is physically available. And in order to maintain consistency with the statute, we think it's important to show that there will be a significant and appreciable reduction in the amount of groundwater pumped going forward. We also recognize that the offset volume will have an impact on the feasibility analysis that CAGRD staff is conducting, because that is continued groundwater pumping. You know, if we decrease the offset, that will allow for increased pumping and to continue in the long term, and that increased groundwater pumping would also require a replenishment by the CAGRD. And so we've been trying to balance the need to reduce the groundwater pumping in the long term in these basins with the costs that we recognize are inevitable in shifting to non-groundwater supplies. And based on our analysis, the 25% offset is defensible because it does substantially reduce groundwater pumping in the long term, which helps to ensure that water supplies will be available for all of the providers' customers in the long term and will improve the outcome throughout the AMA. We also received proposals that we should exclude effluent from the groundwater offset requirement. And as I just described, that groundwater offset component is a critical component of this ADAS process in order to comply with the Assured Water Supply statute. Effluent is likely to be one of the most accessible new alternative supplies for all providers, and particularly in the earliest years, that will be the most readily available. And if we were to exempt effluent from that offset requirement, that would substantially reduce the overall offset to groundwater use, and it would make our ADAS approach less defensible under the statute. And then finally, stakeholders expressed more general concerns regarding the cost and timelines for acquiring alternative supplies. And we recognize that. We recognize that as much as we would love to eliminate all costs and all challenges of acquiring non-groundwater supplies, that that's just not within our power to do. If we could, we would have done it decades ago, I promise. But what we are trying to do with the ADOS rulemaking is create a path for those providers to be able to transition towards those supplies, to give them time to acquire those supplies. And so the combination of both the grandfathered groundwater volume that's included, combined with the groundwater offset for adding additional supplies, and then combining that with the expedited modification provision allows providers to come in with the alternatives, the new alternative supplies that they have, get a designation that allows for at least a few years of growth. And then in the longer term, as they're able to bring those other alternative supplies into their service area, those can then be added into their designation to increase the term of their designation and or increase the amount of growth that they're able to supply with their alternative water supplies. So again, we can't solve all water problems. Would that we could, but this is intended to create a glide path to help make that growth possible in a more timely manner and to recognize the challenges associated with acquiring those supplies. All right, now we're going to go through, are we able to share that? Okay, so we're gonna, I think, stop sharing this and switch over to sharing the PDF for the draft rules. And I think we're going to start with the, let's see, with the document for the commingling rule. What we have done, and these will be posted on our website if they're not already, they may already be posted on the website. But what we've done is you still see the original rule language in the underline, new language is underlined, deleted language is stricken, but the changes from the April draft are highlighted in yellow and shown in red font. So, so that you can identify what those changes are. So the only rule that will be included in the commingling rulemaking package will be Rule 704. Most of these changes you have seen before. And then if you scroll down to the very end of the rulemaking language, we have the change where we've changed the year in both provisions from 2022 to 2023, as we discussed. And then we've added some language we've added an additional paragraph to clarify that we'll be relying on the annual report that was submitted for calendar year 2023 as verified by the director for purposes of that subsection. So those are the only language changes that we're making to the commingling rule at this time. And then we can switch over now to the remainder of the rulemaking package. And we have included new provisions that apply to the Pinal AMA. Most of those provisions are literally a copy and paste of the provisions that apply to Phoenix as well. But walking through, we did make a change to the definition of new alternative water supply to clarify that we are looking at calendar year 2023, relying on the annual report for that calendar year, subject to verification by the director. And we have parallel changes throughout the rule language. So I think we can scroll past to the next section. And again, these are, so this provision is particular in order to apply the rule language directly to the Pinal AMA. Our biggest concern with Pinal is the extinguishment credit structure in Pinal is unique, to say the least. Complicated would also be an understatement, I believe. There are different rules depending on when the grandfathered right was extinguished and when it was pledged to the assured water supply determination. So for the applicability of for transitioning from certificates to a designation, those extinguishment credits will continue to apply to those will be applicable, and we will use the same volumes. So there won't be any change in the overall replenishment requirements for that particular subdivision. But what we want to do is make sure that it's limited to the subdivision that is the subject of that certificate. And particularly in the Pinal AMA, where there is the potential for credits that are substantial and also roll over if they're not used in a particular year. That could result in a windfall that could then eliminate replenishment in other areas, in other parts of the designated provider service area. That is not what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve a net benefit to the aquifer. And so therefore, we're limiting the applicability of those credits to the subdivision to which they were pledged. And that's where they currently apply. We recognize that we'll also have to work through some of the reporting requirements related to this. So we will be working through that process. Oh,
If you can scroll down on the screen
apologies.
and then just past that.
Yeah, that's the provision that I was just discussing. Apologies. And then we are making one correction in previous language, just to clarify that the volume we're describing in this top line that's on your screen that's highlighted is actually the groundwater allowance volume. And then the remainder of the language that you're seeing is nearly identical to the other language that we've already shared, explaining that we'll be relying on calendar year 2023 and we'll be relying on the annual report as verified by the director. Then we move to the provisions that apply to Pinal. And as I mentioned before, we have essentially copied and pasted these provisions. So the calculation of the groundwater volume for the Phoenix AMA, and as well as for the groundwater allowance, will essentially be calculated the same way for both, for ADAS applicants in both the Phoenix and Pinal AMA. Oh, and we have a typo. We've been moving through this quickly. That should be calculation in at the very end of that highlighted language. Looks like we also need an enter, so I'll make a note. And these documents are available on our website now, and when we correct these, we will also be posting the corrected version, obviously. So those are the language changes that we have. And I think that we were going to open it up for questions. First, we'll start with anyone in the room that might have questions. And just so you know, we are planning to move into our next steps and our target schedule for the process. But I just wanted to make sure that if we have questions about the draft language or about the approach, feel free to ask those now. And if you do have questions, if you could come up to the podium, that would be helpful. Okay, do we have any questions on the WebEx? All right, great. We'll move into our rulemaking timeline. Oh, it looks like we may have. Okay,
Helpful. So the question that we have in the WebEx is from Warren Tenney. Warren says the presentation shows that with the groundwater allowance permitted under ADAS will generate a reduction in overall groundwater pumping. However, it still hasn't been explained why such substantial allowances are needed.
So I think the reason why we wanted to go with those volumes of groundwater allowances are because we have providers that will be moving from a member land structure to a member service area structure. And typically when we have new enrollment in the CAGRD, it will tend to be like a new service area. So all of the customers are immediately enrolled once they move in, and it's already part of that structure from the beginning of water service. In this case, we have some areas, if you look, for example, at Queen Creek or at Buckeye, you have some parts of those service areas that have been there for decades and have never been subject to any replenishment requirement. And then you have other lands that are already enrolled as member lands and may have a CAGRD line item on their annual property tax bill, but they don't see it on their water bill every month. And when this converts to a member service area, that is going to go to that is going to be shifting towards a bill that goes to the water provider. And then the water provider, we presume, will pass those costs through to their customers in one way, shape, or form. We are not controlling that methodology or accounting. We know there are a lot of factors that go into that decision, but having the groundwater allowance will allow the providers some ability to help manage the transition, not just for themselves in terms of those costs, but for those customers. And we recognize that this transition towards increased replenishment in that service area and towards new alternative supplies will certainly be beneficial for every customer in that provider service area, because it will increase the reliability of those customers, of the water supplies that those customers are relying on. But it will also allow those customers to see the economic benefits of growth in their area. At the same time, no matter how beneficial that is, sticker shock is always a problem for everyone. And so we want to help the providers manage that sticker shock, both for the individual users that, you know, are the ones who ultimately will have to pay a lot of that bill, as well as for the providers themselves. And giving them that groundwater allowance allows them to help manage those costs and to help transition those costs in for their customers. Are there any other questions? All right, then we will go ahead and move into the schedule. And so we are anticipating filing the notices of docket opening and notices of proposed rulemaking with the Secretary of State imminently. So in early August. These are very rough timeframes, but we do want to make you aware of what we anticipate. And of course, everything is always subject to change. After we publish, it's generally about a 3-week turnaround from the time that we file it with the Secretary of State and when it appears in the Arizona Administrative Register. So you'll be able to anticipate that, but we will also post that link to the Administrative Register on our website. Once that is published, public comments will be accepted for 30 days from that publication date. We're estimating mid-September for that, could be mid to late September. And obviously the notice itself will have that deadline in there. It will also include the date of our public hearing. That will be a formal public hearing, and that will be an opportunity to accept oral comments in addition to written comments. It will also be the same deadline for the close of the rulemaking record. And we will obviously review those comments, determine what types of technical corrections or amendments we need to make. We're targeting making non-substantive amendments in order to keep the process moving forward. And ideally, we'd like to be filing a notice of final rulemaking with the Governor's Regulatory Review Council. We call it GERC. And so we'd like to file that in late September or early October. And then our goal is that we will have a study session with GERC on the draft rules in late October. And then we would be ideally on the calendar for GERC's early November meeting, hoping to get approval at that early November meeting. And then finally, we do intend to seek an immediate effective date because we know that there are providers that are anxiously awaiting the adoption of these rules and hoping that they will take effect sooner rather than later. And if we are able to get approval of that immediate effective date, then the rulemaking would take effect upon on the day that we file it with the Secretary of State's office. Of course, we've included a link to GERC's website where you can find a little bit more information on the rulemaking process, and we'll continue to have updates on our ADA's webpage on our website.
So in closing, the recording and information related to today's meeting will be posted on ADWR's ADA's webpage, and the formal rulemaking notices that were discussed just now will be published in the Arizona Administrative Register. ADWR will also post a link on the ADA's webpage above. And with that, the meeting is oh, sure, we have time for more questions. Would you be able to come up to the mic?
My name is Mike Pierce, Cambridge and Burnham. The schedule that you outlined there looked to me, and I'm not an expert on GERC, but looked to me to be expedited rulemaking, as that term is defined in the statutes.
Well, we are going to expedite the process as much as we can. It is not officially an expedited rulemaking. We will be completing an economic consumer, small business, and economic impact statement. We are having a public hearing and taking public comment. So
that is a big distinction as to whether or not you have to do the economic impact analysis.
yes,
Your intention is to do that in this process,
yes,
in that 30-day window.
yes. So
That's good. I do think that there is some impacts to be considered. Many of the things that you just related to about the economic impact on consumers.
mhm.
Also the economic impact, groundwater offset. Look forward to your analysis.
All right.
Thank you. Any last questions before we adjourn? All right, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.